Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Edward Chandler, and I will be bringing you through our webinar series today, specifically preparing for CMMC compliance, mastering the evidence collection and preparation. Please note this is the second part of a three-part webinar series. The first part is available on demand. So if you did miss the first part, do highly recommend you listening into that first webinar series. Also, as it is a three-part series, please mark this in your calendar. The third part of this three-part series will be happening on November 8th. And the topic will be specifically around from CAPAs to appeals. And that will be on at noon on November 8th. So to introduce you to our speakers today, first I'd like to introduce Nathan Regola. Nathan is a part of the team at Relic Law, and he is a certified CMMC professional, or a CCP, and has supported over 20 NIST 800-53 information system ATOs. Nathan advises federal contractors on cloud and hybrid information systems architecture, SIM integration, in identity access management, and Office 365 configurations in support of CMMC assessments. Nathan is also a Cyber AB certified professional instructor. Along with Nathan, we also have William Orlowitz. Will is a Cyber AB registered practitioner and advises U.S. federal contractors on government cybersecurity regulations, including DFARS 252.204-7012 and the forthcoming Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. Will's clients include defense industrial base contractors, manufacturers, technology companies, and service providers. During the webinar today, we're going to be touching on a few different topics. First, we'll be addressing the overview of CMMC practices. Then we'll be jumping into what are the assessment objectives. We'll do an overview of some definitions. We'll talk a little bit about what evidence that you will need. And then finally, we'll walk through some sample controls. So with that said, I would like to pass the microphone over to Will. Will?
Thanks a lot, Ed. Appreciate the nice introduction there, and I'm excited to present this topic to you today along with Nathan Regola. We're really going to dive pretty deep into some of the key questions that contractors who are preparing for CMMC bring to us in their assessment process journey. And hopefully you get a lot of value out of discussing the topic. So the first area that we're going to address really concerns the overview of the CMMC practices themselves. And so we'll start in on the first substantive slide here, Ed, which covers the anatomy of CMMC practices. So Nate, do you just want to walk us through this basic diagram of what types of material is contained in an individual CMMC practice?
Sure. So we have the control name as our first item here. It essentially combines the NIST 171 numbering, the 3.18, with the CMMC aspect of which level are we on. So in CMMC version 2.0, there's three levels. Level 1, which is federal contract information. Level 2, CUI. And the level 3, the kind of advanced, which will be defined by DoD in the future for contractors with kind of higher level CUI. And so this, we can see here that this is a level 2 practice. It's in the AC, so the access control family. And then if we look at 3.1.8, we'll see that that corresponds to the NIST 171 and 171A controls. And we have the title of unsuccessful logon attempts. We have an assessment objective here, which comes from NIST 171A. Now, these are really important, right? These are what the assessor is going to be looking for satisfaction of this control or practice. We have the potential assessment methods and objects, These also come from NIST Standard 171A. The discussion referenced here is Standard 171, so the non-assessment version of NIST Standard 171, revision 2. This provides kind of the English language helpful reading to what is expected of the control. And then the further discussion often has some examples. And then we have key references, which always cite back to NIST Standard 171 and occasionally an additional reference.
That's great, and we're going to get into each of these in more detail in the next few slides. So we'll leave it there for now. Next slide, please, Ed. So Nathan, I mean, obviously there's a relationship between NIST 800-171 and the CMMC practices. Can you just maybe elaborate on that here for the audience? Sure.
So if you look at NIST 800-171. Revision 2 by itself, you're really kind of cheating yourself, right? Because it's not enough detail. It's the big picture requirement, but you have to understand what needs to be implemented, and what needs to be implemented comes from the assessment objectives, and those come from NIST 800-171A. So those assessment objectives are super important. So that's the determination by NIST of what needs implemented to meet that big picture requirement.
Excellent. That's a huge point for people to note. Next slide, please, Ed. So, Nate, we wanted to dive into a little bit greater detail here with respect to these practice sections. So maybe just walk us through kind of what we're showing here on the screen.
Of course. And this is kind of our editorialization of what these mean, right? So the discussion, we define that as it lays out the cybersecurity principles associated with that practice. And obviously it's commonly associated with the NIST 800-171 documentation. The further discussion kind of offers a further clarification on the practice by framing its impact on security. So it gives you a little broader context view of what the practice is about. The examples often highlight the user's perspective, right? So for example, if you have a visitor log, user walks through the door and is asked to sign in through a visitor log. So it gives you that user view. The potential assessment considerations are really sample assessment questions, and that should prompt what evidence you might be able to use to answer those questions. And then the key references are citations to NIST 800-171, and obviously NIST 800-171 itself contains further references to other government standards. And then also occasionally you have a FAR reference here as well as a key reference in the CMMC practice.
Nate, if you could, I mean, how should folks interpret those key references? I mean, what's the implication of them appearing here in the text of, right, the CMMC practices?
So it's really, I mean, most of the NIST 800-171 is a direct copy and paste in the CMMC materials from NIST 800-171. So it's providing that link. Its value is sometimes if you're not sure what the scope is intended to be of that practice, NIST 800-171 will often cite to the NIST 853 control elements that they pulled that from. So that can give you a hint to what NIST was thinking when they pulled a piece, because they kind of cherry picked parts of NIST 853 controls to make NIST 800-171, right? They didn't mandate all of it. And those pieces, if they picked, part A of a control, it's likely that they intended that to mean what it meant in part A, right? They're not asking you to do the whole NIST 853 thing. They're asking you to do, the part A, for example. So that's where I think its huge value is to consultants and internal staff that are trying to document their system security plan and maybe struggling with where they're supposed to be doing something or what it meant if this CMMC documentation isn't adequate.
That's good to know. I have just one other question on this topic. So the potential assessment considerations, you noted here that often they're sample assessment questions. How closely do you think most assessors will be aligned in terms of those types of questions in what they're doing in their practice?
That's a good question. So under the draft cap, and obviously it's draft, so it is subject to change by the accreditation body. And in the government to the extent they're reviewing and rejecting it. The assessor ultimately maintains the ability to negotiate with the OSC and ensure that they've seen enough evidence to be satisfied, right? Because the burden's on the OSC to show the evidence and convince the assessor that there's adequate evidence to find the practice met. So simply, if the OSC can't provide enough evidence, they fail by default, right? So it's a issue of bringing the evidence to the assessor, and until the assessor says you have enough, that's great. You've met the requirement. So I think there's going to be fairly broad consensus on what the requirements mean. I think it's going to vary based on assessor what type of evidence they're looking for in terms of sampling percentages and so forth. And it's also, I think, going to depend on the organization, how complex the organization is. And, for example, if evidence was previously presented that was, problematic and there's not a lot of trust there, it's likely to drive the sampling rate up, right? Because ultimately it's about convincing the assessment team that everything is in order.
No, that's a great explanation. So I think, obviously very helpful for teams that are preparing to look at those assessment considerations and think about how they might be assessed with respect to the particular practice. Ed, let's jump to the next slide to talk about assessment objectives. So I think as part of this presentation, this is probably one of the, if I were to note anything, it's probably the importance of the assessment objectives. So Nate, can you describe what they are and why they're important?
Sure. So this is really what people are going to be assessed on. When you think about the high-level control in the Standard 171, the government documents always have, kind of the standards of the Standard 171, and then the assessment guide for that standard, and that's the Standard 171A. So these are the actual things that need to be present. So that, the 110 controls for CMMC is a little deceiving. If you look at the assessment objectives, right, there's a multiple of that. So these, I think there's a couple takeaways here, and it's usually, and you kind of see it with this sample here, and it's repeated throughout most of the controls. So they spell out what you need to achieve via administrative or technical controls, and what the assessor is going to be looking for flows quite naturally from this. So we've categorized this as, there's really two elements or two types of these. There's the policy element, right? And there's the practical element. So if we look at A here, and the policy element is usually first, it has language like is defined. And so that choice, right, so defining, should be in a document somewhere, right? A system security plan, a policy, a procedure. And then you have the practical element. So essentially, are you implementing the thing that you've defined should be implemented? So, and there's often flexibility in this implementation, right? Whether it's going to be administrative or technical. So, and there's going to be, in this example, right? So if you chose not to do this through a technical means, right, you could arguably do that, right? You could say, okay, well, I'm not going to enforce this through an MDM solution or Active Directory. I'm going to enforce this through a guard, right? I'm going to have a guard standing over the computer, and they're going to count how many times the person has entered the password in, and then they're going to tell them, hey, get up from the chair. You've had your 3 tries. That's technically possible, right? You could prove that, if you could prove with sufficient evidence that you always do that, right? You always have guards stationed next to someone's computer. CMMC does not have a problem with that. I mean, practically speaking, I think very few OSCs are likely to, station a guard at every computer or two. But the regulations don't require you to implement this via technical means. It's just likely going to be the most practical and cost-effective way to do that, and also prove that you are doing it. But it does not.
So is it fair to? No, thanks, Nate. Is it fair to say that when it comes to the assessment objectives, that the written policy documentation has to include that language, and then that should be obviously mirrored in the implementation?
I think that's the cleanest way, to avoid, nuanced discussions with the assessment team, right? I mean, and I recognize, you have a sophisticated organization that already has a lot of security documentation and program. It can be frustrating to encounter this language. The means of limiting unsuccessful logon attempts is defined. So if you just simply put that in your policy documentation, there's no doubt that that directly addresses, point A, right? Where I think companies get into trouble is they say, user accounts, limit unsuccessful login attempts to, 3 tries. Okay, well, that raises the question, what about service accounts, user accounts in your documentation? What about device accounts, right? So if you reword things, you have to be very careful that you don't de-scope what the intent of the practice is, because then an assessor can say, well, it doesn't look like you're really covering the full scope. What about service accounts? What about, emergency accounts, et cetera? So copying the language is a really clean way to do it. If you can't do that, you just want to make sure that your own definitions don't contradict the expectations of NIST 171.
Excellent. All right, let's move on to the next set of slides. So here we're going to talk about the overview of some of the key definitions in CMMC from an assessment perspective. So Nate, there's these 2 terms, adequacy and sufficiency, and I think they're relatively easy to confuse, and so you really need to think about what they mean in each given context. So can you walk us through both of these?
Sure. And if anyone wants to read about this, you can see the draft cap on the Cyber AB's website, and these flow directly from that. So adequacy is the criteria needed to determine if a given evidence artifact, right? So that could be a document, an interview response, a demonstration, is demonstrating the performance of a CMMC practice. So, does the team have the right evidence? So, for example, in the control we just talked about, if someone were to propose evidence of, the Active Directory setting that controls unsuccessful login attempts, is that the right evidence? Yeah, it certainly sounds like that would be the right evidence, right? And then sufficiency addresses the question of, is it enough of the right evidence? So if we extend that example, if you only had one Active Directory environment and all of your computers were managed by Active Directory, then evidence from your Active Directory configuration would presumably be adequate, right? Because you could be adequate. We said it was adequate. It's going to be sufficient too, right? Because you said you only have one Active Directory. So you're going to cover 100% of the assets in your environment. Great. If you have 3 Active Directory environments, a screenshot from one is not necessarily going to be sufficient, right? Because what are the settings on the other 2 environments? Or maybe you have systems that aren't managed by Active Directory, in which case, how are you meeting the intent of that control? So that's something that's going to be a key part of assessment preparation as well, right? Because if you're gathering evidence, you want to make sure you're addressing the sufficiency part too, so that the assessment team doesn't come back to you and say, okay, this kind of looks okay, but we just need more evidence, right? And then you're having that back and forth, which is just going to slow things down.
Yeah, and I think the way that it's framed up here is a helpful way for people to think about it. So, when we're thinking of adequacy, the question is, does the assessment team have the quote unquote right evidence? And then sufficiency is, do they have enough of the right evidence? So you can see one is asking a different question, and the other is more of a measurement. So it helps to kind of think about that in terms of your own implementation. Next slide, please, Ed. So obviously, as I think some people know, there are different forms of evidence. So, we've kind of put those on display here. Nate, can you talk about the different types, maybe, what some examples would be, and maybe when certain types of evidence would be more appropriate for certain types of things, et cetera?
Sure. And I think, it's helpful, from an assessor's perspective, right? I think it's helpful for OSCs to think about it in terms of the assessment perspective as well, right? Is that you're trying to convince the assessor that you have, that you're doing the things that are being asked. So I think there's going to be some logical conclusions that you can draw, right? So and I'll talk about that as we go through the 5 types. The documentation, right? Policies, procedures, guidelines, right? These are generally written things at level 2 and above. They're not required to be written for a level 1, a federal contract information self-assessment. Interviews, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? You're conducting interviews with personnel at various levels within the organization. Artifact review. So this artifacts is pretty strong evidence, right? You have system logs, audit records, security incident logs, access logs, testing, It's also quite strong evidence, right? So if you show the assessor, right, that you're trying to log in and you enter the incorrect password, and then it says, it gives you a message, the account is locked, and then you show them an Active Directory that the account is locked. So it's very strong evidence. And observations, right? So for example, you check into a facility and you've signed the visitor log and you're sitting there waiting for your appointment with the team, and you see 10 other people signing the visitor log as you walk in. So that's an example of an observation. And if you think about what evidence is going to be best, right? So if we go back to our unsuccessful logon attempt, is an interview with the CISO really the most appropriate evidence for that, right? Probably not, right? Because if that's a technical control that's implemented in 3 different Active Directory servers, the best evidence is really going to be artifact reviews, testing, right? Observations. It's probably not going to be an interview of one person, right? Because how's the assessor going to understand, does this person have, detailed knowledge of how that's configured, right? The assessor is probably not hands-on keyboard in those 3 different environments to configure that setting. And so, documentation is going to be a piece of it, right? Because you're required to define it for a CUI system. So certainly that documentation is going to be great for the definition part. But when you actually want to see if it's done in practice, so the part B of the control, I really think artifact review and testing is going to be your best evidence proposal to the assessment team.
So given that the main theme of this presentation concerns evidence, and I think it's important to note that as you're preparing to be assessed and to demonstrate to an assessor, right, that you've implemented the requirements, you really need to think through the types of things that you just mentioned, Nate, which is, what is the most useful piece of information or observable material that you can supply to satisfy the requirement, right? So that's going to differ from practice to practice, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think it reminded me of a point. It's ultimately about cost and efficiency, right? I'm assuming most OSCs don't want to spend more money than is required on an assessment, right? And so, is there a way to do an interview setup for that control on unsuccessful login attempts? Sure, right? Is an assessor going to find an interview with one person, sufficient? Probably not, right? So do you want to have, 6 interviews, for example, with people in different areas of the organization to determine that they actually do have this thing implemented across the different environments? Or would you rather present a single artifact to prove that it's implemented?
That's a great point. Yep. The more interviews you do, certainly the more protracted your assessment will be. Okay, next slide, please, Ed. Okay, so these next sections kind of just talk about how do we know what evidence we'll need. So Nate, maybe just walk us through our outline here and kind of get them thinking about how to think of this topic.
Of course. So, in the CAP and the other documents, scoping and architecture diagrams are a key part of, a CUI system, right? Obviously kind of ignoring the FCI and just calling that out, because when you're self-assessing, you have more leeway in how you do things. There's less formality. But it's CUI level 2 and above. You're expected to have, scoping diagrams and architecture diagrams. And that's really going to drive a lot of the assessment, the kind of cost estimates and the planning, right, for the evidence. And so the OSC is going to propose evidence, and the assessment team is going to review that and decide if they concur or would want some modifications before the assessment starts. And so if we look at a scoping diagram, an architecture diagram, and we see that there's external service providers, and we can see the number of systems. So the example I gave is, okay, you have Active Directory. Let's assume you have Azure Active Directory as well. You have, a network firewall. You have a switch. You have Windows 10, laptops or desktops. You might have a server that's a security protection asset or a CUI asset, and you have a server that's a contracted risk managed asset. So what type of evidence would you do for that control? So, I would say for your Azure Active Directory, you should prepare to demonstrate the configuration. And I would just capture a screenshot, right? If you're responsible for the system, you can capture a screenshot, set it aside in an evidence folder, And when the assessment team is doing their early review to look, at the kind of the quick check of whether the evidence is adequate, you already have that and see that, hey, guess what? This is captured, 6 months ago. It just suggests that the OSC is really on top of things and understands what's required and has already captured it. Not to say they're not going to, ask for an updated one, but it gets everyone in the habit of monitoring and capturing evidence. Obviously, Active Directory server, you're going to, be expected to demonstrate this if requested as part of your, negotiation. Firewall, right? Same thing. Those are typically security protection assets. Switches are typically security protection assets. Windows 10 device, if they're, SPA or CUI. So if you have group policy, right, you might pull a group policy report and have a screenshot. If you're using Intune from Azure, you might, demonstrate those settings and capture a screenshot of the Azure setting. The same type of scheme for a server. And then we get to contractor risk managed asset, right? So there's less formality required here. Obviously, you're supposed to manage them according to your own risk policies. So whatever your policy states you should do for a CRMA, you should implement that, right? It might be a larger number of unsuccessful passwords permitted. So maybe you require, allow 3 unsuccessful logins for your CUI and security protection assets, and you might allow, 6 for your CRMA assets by policy. So if your CRMA policy says that you're going to allow 6 unsuccessful login attempts, then you should set that asset to 6 unsuccessful logins. If you don't want to diverge your policy, right, you could simply adopt the CMMC requirement and just say we set all of our systems to 3 unsuccessful login attempts, or whatever the number is for your organization. And this is important because if there's a spot check of this done, you don't want to be seen as not managing your CRMA assets in line with your risk management policy. So you have more leeway, but you also should follow your policy.
No, those are great examples, and I think really help illustrate the way that organizations should be thinking about these items. So, Nate, I know that the next several slides are walkthroughs of sample control, so maybe we can jump to that. So there's 3 different sample practices that we've pulled together for today. And so we're basically just going to kind of walk through each of these as a hypothetical to help, again, illustrate how to be thinking about this stuff. So Nate, why don't you go ahead and take us through this particular practice?
Sure. So this is, specifying essentially a password history requirement. And so if you think about it as you can't, reuse the last of your 24 passwords, right, in a kind of extreme example. And so we see that this thing, it says is specified, right? So this is kind of very similar to the is defined, right? So you have to determine how many what password history you're going to retain in your authentication system. And you have to define that somewhere. And then, of course, they're asking you to actually configure your systems that are in scope to prevent the reuse of the passwords for the specified number of generations. So it's kind of a technical write-up in the assessment objectives. And then you can see that the further discussion here has a bit more friendly explanation of what this actually is. And if you think about, evidence for this. So, where are you going to define this? Probably on a security protection asset that's controlling your authentication and authorization. If you have a central authentication and authorization, or a smaller number of central authentication and authorization systems, that's where you're going to be able to most likely collect the evidence, right? So Active Directory, an LDAP server, if you have multiple authentication or authorization systems in your environment, right, based on your architecture diagrams and your system security plan, then you should think about how you begin to pull that evidence together for each of those systems.
Excellent.
And
So, go ahead, Nate. Did you have another comment?
sure, and and I would think, I mean, if I were doing this at the OSC, I would think about proposing, right, configuration screenshots, right, or logs, right. I mean, I think that's the most efficient evidence. Not to say you couldn't do a bunch of interviews, but I think you get there more efficiently with the technical, the screenshot of the configurations or a report.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Ed, can you take us to the next scenario? Okay, Nate, what do you think about this one?
Sure. So maintain audit logs of physical access. So I think this is, the physical, environment controls are really important, right? And those are in the draft cap require physical, review by an assessor, right? So they allow hybrid assessment. So many of the controls can be done virtually, but there are certain controls that do require physical presence by, at least one auditor. And so these should not be dismissed. So this asks us to maintain audit logs of physical access. And there's obviously a little bit of leeway here, right? Because it says determine if audit logs are maintained. Well, for how long, right? So that would be one of the first questions I had if I were drafting this for an organization. So you can see the discussion has quite a bit of information here. They reference that audit logs can be procedural, right? So a visitor log essentially. They can be automated, right? Perhaps a PIV card or other type of proximity card that people use at doors. And they go on. So you see the further discussion is helpful. Obviously, there's a lot of great information here. So you see the assessment considerations are the logs of physical access to sensitive areas maintained per retention requirements. And you note that they say both authorized access and visitor access. And then are they retained for as long as required, right? So what's as long as required? Well, I mean, if you have an incident response policy, right, that's part of CMMC, you're going to want to align this, right? So if your incident response plan says that you're going to be able to refer to logs for 6 months and you only have your physical access logs for 3 weeks, that's problematic, right? Because if somebody conducted a breach using physical access as a starting point, you wouldn't have the logs to trace that part of it, right? So you want to harmonize your different practices. And this is an example where the organization is going to want to pick a sensible number for audit log retention. And audit log retention to me doesn't seem like a super expensive thing to retain unless you have some, really expensive hardware that is where storage space is really at a premium on your, badge reader, and you just can't store them very long. How can you store them in a way that supports your incident response, or how do you structure your incident response plan so that you're in compliance with your own policies? If you have physical logs, right, this is probably as simple as the person who has custody of those physical logs opening a filing cabinet and showing the assessor, look, we have a whole stack of logs. Right? It's not probably very expensive to keep an extra 5 pages in your filing cabinet, right? So you pull them out and say, here, assessor, got these logs back 2 years. Oh, wow, that's great. And do you have to keep them for 2 years? No, probably not. But it's not probably a very expensive thing to do. Obviously, electronic things, you may have considerations, but you want to be able to show some type of report or the logs themselves to prove that they are being retained for the required time.
Yeah, I think the nexus that you drew there between the audit logs and, for example, incident response where you're doing a postmortem after learning of a security incident is an important one, because it's not immediately obvious when you're thinking about this particular practice, and you do have to kind of understand the interplay between the practices to think through those types of considerations. Obviously, any audit logs or access logs, including physical access logs, serve multiple purposes, and one of which is obviously for forensics purposes or investigatory purposes and after a known incident. So it does help, I think, to think about these practices maybe step back and view them from a little bit of a higher elevation to see how they relate to each other, how they interplay, and how they should be, constructed in order to be consistent across the implementation of other practices. Does that make sense, Nate?
No, it absolutely does, and I think it's a great point, because I think people get caught up on the compliance nature of it. Is, oh, how long? What's the minimum amount of time we have to retain these paper logs? And retaining a couple pieces of paper in a filing cabinet probably isn't that expensive. And ultimately, companies should be thinking about risk and security, right? I mean, if you have a breach and you have to call law enforcement, do you want to be in a position where you're telling your insurance company and law enforcement, no, we didn't save 5 pieces of paper in a filing cabinet, right? It's almost it's like the cost of saving that versus the pain that you're going to have is going to be pretty extraordinary. So try to think about that from a risk management perspective and a security perspective of what's a reasonable time. And the example here even says, okay, you retain the paper sign-in sheets in a locked filing cabinet for 1 year, right? So yeah, they're kind of almost giving you a hint here that if you retain them for a year, that's probably going to get you a pass on this control and an assessment. And it seems like a reasonable time if you think about breaches. What's the average time to notice a breach, right? From the publicly available reports, and that a year feels like a reasonable time, right? 3 weeks feels too short.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right about getting caught up in the compliance aspect of it, but there's the adoption of the practices should, in theory, be comprehensible and it should be based in reality for to achieve the maximum intent, I would say. All right, we've got one more walkthrough, so let's jump to that one. So Nate, this one concerns session lock, so maybe you can take us through this particular practice.
Sure. So this is another kind of bit interesting in kind of the NIST language here. Because use session lock with pattern hiding displays. It's a really fancy way of saying essentially you should have something like a locked screensaver that's not displaying confidential data when somebody takes a break to visit the coffee machine. And if we look at it here, this kind of follows the pattern, right? So you have to define a period of inactivity where the system is going to initiate a lock. So some policy or procedure document is going to define that, or your SSP, and that the access to the system and viewing of data is prevented by this lock being initiated. So essentially the locked screensaver loading, and that the previously visible information. So for example, if I have CUI document up on the screen, the screensaver is not going to be showing that to everyone that walks by. And what would you do here for evidence? So this is clearly hinting at a technical implementation, right? And I think this is one where you would really strain integrity to come up with a kind of non-technical implementation for this. If you have a computer, right? If you don't have a computer, certainly this control is going to be easier. But if you're using computers, this is very much calling for a technical implementation. And they're going to be looking at the configuration for the endpoints that are in scope, right? And I keep going back to SSP architecture diagram, scoping documents. What types of systems do you have, right? So if you're using Mac and Windows and Chromebooks, right, and they're going to expect to see that you have this required, right, on all of those types of endpoints if they're all in scope, right? They're all CUI assets or SPAs, etc. So be prepared. Lots of organizations have different types of endpoints. You're going to want to make sure you're covering all those and you're prepared from an evidence perspective to present evidence on all of those. And I think this also calls out for a report from group policy or MDM tool, or some little automated report that you have, or a demonstration, right? And you might have to demonstrate multiple times, right? If you have Chromebooks and Mac and Windows, you may have to do 3 demonstrations. So encourage people to think about that.
Yeah, I have a general question, and I think it applies to both this scenario dealing with the practice concerning session locks, as well as it applies to the previous one concerning unsuccessful logon attempts. How is there, some pointers for OSCs to identify, for example, when it comes to unsuccessful logon attempts, for example, all of the different accounts that that policy needs applied to, and same thing with here with session lock, like all the different endpoints or devices. What is the best way so that they can ensure that they are adequately covering the required accounts, the required devices? Are there some just general pointers that you can offer?
Sure. So I'll try to answer the device question first. So if we think about, if we start at the scoping document, so let's say you have, general users. So, you've got salespeople and engineers accessing CUI and doing work, and you've got system administrators, kind of simplified example here, right? So the system administrators and their devices are generally going to be what's called a security protection asset, because oftentimes, kind of hypothetical, right? The system administrator is not accessing CUI to do their job. They're providing security protection for the information system, and the engineers and salespeople are accessing the CUI to do their job. So in that example, all the devices that they use that can access CUI or that manage the CUI system are going to be in scope for this session lock control and the unsuccessful login attempt example. So as many device types as their endpoints would be in scope. So if their endpoints lock, according to this pattern hiding control, and maybe they're logged into something else from their endpoint. So maybe they use their endpoint to remote desktop to some other system, but if they get a coffee, their endpoint is locked. You don't necessarily have to lock both things, right? If you're locking the endpoint, you should be able to satisfy the control, right? It's the idea that their endpoint is locked, and therefore you can't use that endpoint to do anything else, even if that's RDP into a server somewhere. Is it best practice to have your server lock automatically on RDP? Yes. Do you have to do that to prove this control? No, probably not. How do you come up with a time for this? So you can look, and obviously the FedRAMP requirements are not controlling, right? But if FedRAMP here says, and I'm just making this up, 5 minutes, you certainly wouldn't need to be more strict than FedRAMP, right? So FedRAMP is generally beyond CMMC level 2, right? So you'd say, okay, well, if we have 5 minutes or less, we're definitely fine, right? If FedRAMP says 5 minutes, if FedRAMP says 2 minutes, right, then you can kind of use that to gauge. You probably get a little more leeway from FedRAMP most of the time, but also think about risk management, right? If you have a super busy offices, do you want a computer sitting there for 4 minutes unlocked, right? If somebody's grabbing a coffee, you should think about that. So I would say FedRAMP can kind of be your high water mark. If you do something FedRAMP level, you're almost certainly going to be fine for CMMC, and you can use your own knowledge about your environment to try to come up with a reasonable number, but it at least helps you kind of level set in my mind what's stringent. And then in terms of accounts, as part of the AC and IA controls, you should have an inventory of accounts for your information system. So you want to think about which accounts can directly log in, right? So if you have accounts that can't be directly logged in, so if you have to log into an endpoint first, for example, so maybe you have a system administrator account and that person has to log into an endpoint first, and then they can only access their system administrator account through remote desktop, then you wouldn't necessarily have to have this session lock on the system administrator account, because if they have to use an endpoint first, that's going to occur at the endpoint and the user account where they log into the endpoint, and not kind of the second account of once they're already in. So you can kind of use that knowledge of your environment and your account listing to figure out kind of where things are truly required, right? If you think about it, usually at the first impression point, right? So you don't have to have 7 VPNs, right, tunneled into each other. If you're FIPS validating traffic in an outer VPN, you don't have to have 3 more VPNs inside of that are also FIPS validated, right? They're just asking you to encrypt it once, not 4 times.
Yeah, Nate, I know we talked about it, I think in the first presentation, but it's come up a number of times in this presentation. So for those of us that that can't recall, can you just briefly, to close us out, just rehash what the difference is between a CUI asset, a security protection asset, a contractor risk managed asset, and then basically an out of scope asset?
Sure. So at a high level, a CUI asset is something that's going to store, transmit, or process CUI. So think about this as an endpoint where you can display a CAD diagram of a CUI product. And that's probably the simplest example. A printer that's going to print a CUI blueprint is going to be another potential example of a CUI asset. That could also be a specialized asset. A security protection asset is going to be something that provides security for your information system, so for your in-scope information system. So for example, if Active Directory provides your user accounts, authentication and authorization for your endpoints, that's going to be a security protection asset. So in this sense, right, Active Directory is not intended to store CUI, right? It stores user accounts and passwords and password policies and so forth. Contractor risk managed asset is something that could store, process, or transmit CUI, but is not intended to by practice and policy. So for example, if you have, let's say you have a CAD program and you have some users that work on defense stuff and some users that don't, right? So your users that don't access CUI because you have role-based access control in place and they're not assigned to the group that's working on defense engineering diagrams, they could theoretically, right, the tools, their computer is capable of displaying CUI. It's capable of connecting to the system that has CUI, but since they're not in the appropriate group, they can't access the CUI. So that's a contractor risk managed asset, because if you kind of do things wrong, right, those users that aren't supposed to have CUI could end up with CUI. Your kind of specialized assets are things like IoT devices, factory floor equipment that may or may not process CUI. So this is a recent change that I think is very helpful for OSCs. So in the earliest version of CMMC 1, if you had a CNC machine that was taking CUI diagrams and creating them, that device would have been required to be treated as a CUI asset and assessed. Obviously, that can be extremely complex given the number of devices that manufacturing companies have, and the fact that you may not always be able to, patch them and control all of the practices on them. So these have very limited assessment scope and are not really going to be fully assessed as a CUI asset at this time. And then out of scope is something like, let's say, a thermostat, right? So it's just incapable of processing CUI. It's ideally, right, it's on a different network, physically or logically isolated from your information system. And so then you're going to classify that network-enabled thermostat as an out-of-scope asset.
So sorry, Nick, go ahead.
So it ultimately means you've got different level of assessment rigor, right? So the out-of-scope asset is not really subject to the assessment. It's extremely limited, right? It's just, yes, that makes sense that your thermostat can't process CUI. It stays on a different network here. It's out of scope, right? And then as you go up, contractor risk managed, and then to SPA and CUI, those are the highest level where they're assessed against all controls. CRMA is very limited as to spot checks to make sure that the things you have in place are appropriate and that classification is appropriate.
Yeah, so just to try to bring it home, I mean, we've talked a lot about individual practices today, the components of those practices, and the evidence that an assessor might be looking for, and the types of evidence. And I think the categories of assets that you have, it's important to emphasize that categorizing those correctly at the outset is going to determine how these practices apply. And so the more work you do up front to get that right is going to make your job in terms of applying practices that much easier. I find that a lot of OSCs want to jump immediately to applying practices and trying to come up with evidence to support them, but that's really working in reverse. And would you agree with that, Nate?
I would agree. I think it's like scoping is kind of like surveying, right? And it's like you don't want to build a house before you know the boundaries of the property and where you should be able to build, right? Because it just ultimately ends up sometimes in rework, right? And it's smoother if you start with scoping.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. With that, Ed, I think we've covered today's presentation, so I'll turn it back to you.
Awesome. Well, no, thank you, Will. Thank you, Nate, for walking us through today. At this point, we'll open it up for Q&A. We'll give people a couple of minutes to put their questions into the chat. While we're waiting for that, just as a reminder, there will be a webinar that will be coming up again on November 8th, which will be the third part of the 3-part series. So please, make sure that, when you do see that invite come out, that you do register and put it into your calendar. Looks like there was a question that just came in from Philip. It looks like he's asking around, is there anything that you can recommend as a starting point for CMMC?
It sounds like the questions that focus on implementation, and so I'll assume that. So yeah, I think starting with the controls at level 1 is a great starting point to work toward level 2. As those foundational controls begin, if you're going to be at least level 2, start with documenting the level 1 controls and putting those practices in place. If you're aiming for level 2, you want to formally document those, right? So you can kind of start with documenting what you have, right? It's kind of what's in place in your organization, and then you can compare that to the requirements and the assessment objectives. And I feel like a lot of organizations, it's just helpful to have written down what you're already doing, and then you can be concerned with whether that's in alignment with what's being asked. And then if you do bring in consultants, I think it's easier to have what you're already doing written down, and then you can discuss that with the consultants. Hey, here's what we're doing. Does this really meet the intent? We're not sure, right? It's a better starting point than a consultant having to try to interview a lot of people and figure it out. And then if you do that, you can start then marching toward level 2 and tackling that set of controls, which obviously broadens the scope quite a bit. But certainly level 1 does get you started on the right path.
Yeah, I would just add to that one area that might be helpful, depending on where you're at in this process. A consultant can help up front, basically identify the scope of what your IT environment and your larger environment may be, right? So, CMMC deals with information systems, right? So that the information system and the scope of that is what is going to be submitted to the assessor for assessment. So if you're not sure, for example, what parts of your IT system or your enterprise are within scope, it might help to have some surgical assistance there up front, just to kind of help sort of pin that down, and then you can kind of decipher from there how you want to move forward. But a lot of organizations really struggle to define the boundaries of what it is that will need to be assessed based on the types of information they receive, where they store it, the third parties that they work with as vendors, et cetera. So just a thought on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you can kind of follow the data, right, as to the extent that you feel comfortable doing that in house, and ultimately it's about the flow of CUI and the relationship of those assets to the security protection assets.
Thank you very much, Nate and Will. There is another question from Jennifer. If I'm looking to enter the federal government space for business purposes, how can I determine what level I should be targeting for CMMC?
Yeah,
so it's going to. Oh, sorry, Nate. Go ahead.
So obviously, I'm sure Will has some thoughts too. So, federal contract information is level 1, right? And there's a lot of, the government likes to call things federal contract information. You may have heard about the leak of the CMMC 2.1 documents. So it's not believed that there's going to be too many companies that are going to be kind of exempt from assessment at level 2. So if you think there's going to be CUI involved, it'll probably at some point involve a third-party assessment. And I'll turn it over to Will.
Yeah, I think if you're thinking about entering the federal space, it would be helpful, to explore which particular parts of the federal government you're going to be working with. For example, if it's DoD and you're going to be working in a capacity where you're going to be supplying, bespoke products or services for them on government contracts, or even as, a subcontractor to a prime contractor, it's very likely that you will have the requirements that are associated with controlled unclassified information, or CUI, which is what CMMC, which is what many contractors are most concerned about, because that in most cases is going to require, as Nate mentioned, independent assessment at level 2, and which is rigorous. So it really depends. But if you know the area that you're going into, I think early conversations with your prospective customers or the agency itself might help identify the types of requirements that those contracts would have. And keep in mind that no matter how far you are down the supply chain, generally speaking, these requirements flow down. So they are applied directly to the prime contractor from the source, the government source, and then the prime contractor applies it to their applicable subcontractors, and those subcontractors then apply the requirements downward. So simply being somewhere buried in the supply chain doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be affected by some of these cybersecurity requirements.
A potential, for example, thinking like a staffing situation or providing labor, sometimes higher tier contractors are willing to, assign devices to, subcontractors. So that might be a way of, kind of working around it, right? So not having to invest in all the stuff. If you have a higher tier contractor that's willing to provide you, IT services to access the CUI, that can be a way to, to avoid implementing some of this in-house.
Thank you, Will and Nate, for answering Jennifer's question. The next question is from Luis. What is the biggest misconception that you see through your engagements with CMMC?
The biggest misconceptions, well, at the surface level, there's some misconceptions about, I think, whether or not this is actually happening. I was just reading the DoD's 2023 defense priorities. We know that CMMC is expressly included in those in terms of defending the homeland. We know from looking at the leaked CMMC 2.1 documents that it looks like this is going forward. Also, we see that the rulemaking process has begun. So to implement CMMC into the Federal Register. So we see the movement of CMMC because there was some stop and go with the process, but that's one of the biggest misconceptions. And I think some contractors think, well, this is just never really going to happen, and they forget that right now, if they are already receiving or creating CUI, they already have these obligations essentially under NIST 800-171, and so they should have been complying with them all along. CMMC is really providing this independent method of assurance, right? It's an assessment to independently verify that the contractors are complying with their obligations. So those are some basic misconceptions, but I don't know if there's more specific ones that you can think of, Nate.
Yeah, I have one example. I think there's maybe a misconception about the OSC's responsibility, during an assessment, that the assessor is going to kind of put together this really sophisticated evidence collection plan. And ultimately, if you look at the CAP, the OSC is, responsible for kind of proposing a draft, evidence collection plan, right? Kind of we outlined how you might think about evidence. And so the OSC is going to have to, kind of participate extensively to prepare, evidence and so forth for the assessment and put, help with the management of that project. So that's one of the misconceptions I see.
Awesome. No, thank you, Will and Nate, for the answer to that question. We're running up on time. I know we didn't get through everybody's questions today, so what we'll do is we'll follow up after the webinar with any questions. But please feel free to reach out, before or after if there are any additional questions that you have today that we weren't able to cover. Again, please keep in mind the next webinar will be November 8th. At noon Central. Please, put that in your calendar and keep an eye out for the next registration email to come out. But thank you. I'd like to thank both Will and Nate for both your time today and going through and making some clarifications on CMMC for all of our guests. Thank you.
Thank you.